What happens when the person who fires you thinks you're powerless, but you know every secret in the building? She was young, ruthless, and newly in charge. The first thing she did? Fire me on the spot. But what she didn't realize was that I built this place from the ground up, and I wasn't leaving quietly. It was a Monday, the kind you feel in your bones the second your alarm buzzes. The office lights flickered overhead as I stepped into the building I had helped design 15 years ago. My name is Ethan Ward. I'd been with Halden and Company since it was little more than a warehouse and a dream. That morning, I made my usual walk past reception, nodding to security and grabbing my usual black coffee from the break room. Half cream, no sugar, but something felt off. Whispers died when I walked past. Eyes didn't meet mine. Even Brenda at reception, who always greeted me with a warm, "Good morning, Ethan," gave me a tight, unreadable smile. Something was shifting in the air, and I could feel it before I even stepped into my office. By the time I reached my desk, there was an unfamiliar envelope sitting neatly at the center. My name typed on the front. Inside, a single-page letter, printed in cold HR language. Effective immediately. My services were no longer required. No explanation. No meeting. Just like that, 15 years erased. I stood there, stunned, gripping the letter in one hand while my coffee cooled in the other. I scanned the floor for anyone, who could explain. That's when I saw her, standing in the glass conference room with her arms crossed. Kelsey Halden, the boss's daughter, barely 30, smirking like she'd won something. And just like that, I knew who had pulled the trigger. I wasn't even given the courtesy of a meeting. No call from HR, no scheduled sit-down. Just a white piece of paper with my name on it and Kelsey Halden's signature at the bottom. The office felt like a theater of silence, every familiar face avoiding eye contact as I walked past. It was the kind of betrayal that doesn't feel real at first, like you're waiting for someone to shout, "Just kidding." But this wasn't a joke. I'd given this company my nights, weekends, and the better part of my youth. I stayed through recessions, late-stage audits, and the founder's heart attack. And this is how they ended it? No warning, no reason, just goodbye. I stormed into her office, demanding an explanation. She barely looked up from her screen. "We're restructuring," she said flatly, "and your role no longer fits the new direction." That was it. No gratitude, no acknowledgement of everything I'd done. She acted like I was a leftover from the old world she was trying to erase. I wanted to yell, to tell her she had no idea what she was doing. But I didn't. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked out. Not because I was defeated, no. I was thinking, planning, because what she didn't know, and what she clearly underestimated, was that I wasn't just some employee. I was the architect of the very systems she now controlled. Kelsey Halden had arrived like a summer storm, flashy, loud, and impossible to ignore. She'd studied abroad, picked up buzzwords from trendy tech conferences, and came back thinking she could outsmart experience with energy. She was the founder's only child, freshly appointed after her father's early retirement following health issues. The board, likely pressured, had handed her the reins. Her first week was all flash and meetings. She made surface-level changes, painted walls, new logos, free granola bars in the break room. But under the gloss was someone insecure, someone who couldn't see beyond a spreadsheet. Kelsey saw power as a title, not something earned. And she saw me as an obstacle, not a mentor, not an ally, but a relic. What she failed to understand was who I really was. I wasn't just operations director. I was the institutional memory of Halden and Company. I knew where the skeletons were buried because I buried some of them myself. I handled the founder's cover-ups. I knew which client accounts were legitimate and which ones were polished smoke. I built the internal server structure. I wrote the original employee onboarding processes. When we switched vendors, I personally negotiated the contracts. I didn't just do my job, I was the job. And now, the person who fired me didn't know the difference between a firewall and a coffee filter. She thought she could erase me. But I knew better. I knew where all the threads led. And soon, I'd be pulling on them. Loyalty isn't something you plaster on a wall or print on a mug. It's what you prove when nobody's watching. I stayed late when no one asked me to. I solved crises without needing applause. When other executives jumped ship during downturns, I stayed. When the founder, Charles Alden, faced legal pressure for insider dealings 5 years ago, I was the one who found a way to separate the company from the fire without burning it down. I protected this business like it was my own, not because I had equity, but because I believed in what we were building. We started small, 20 people and a rented floor. I helped turn that into a regional player with 5 branches. There were times I could have left. Bigger offers, better pay, and far less stress. But I stayed because I thought it mattered. Charles used to tell me, "Your family, Ethan." That meant something, at least it used to. But loyalty in business is like glass, clear, fragile, and often broken without a sound. The moment Kelsey stepped in, that quiet understanding was gone. She never once asked about the systems I designed, never sat with me to understand what kept the wheels turning. She was too busy being in charge to realize the building ran on loyalty, not software. And once that loyalty was shattered, she was about to find out what happened when the one man holding it all together no longer cared. Looking back, I can see the signs were there. They started small, harmless on the surface, but revealing in hindsight. Kelsey would ask to be CC'd on emails that had nothing to do with her department. She started inviting junior staff to closed-door meetings without telling the department heads. Once, she called an emergency strategy session during quarterly reporting week, forcing key staff to reschedule presentations we'd spent weeks preparing. At first, I thought she was just adjusting to the role. She was young, yes, but maybe she'd learn. I gave her the benefit of the doubt. That was my first mistake. There were moments, tiny, uncomfortable ones, when I'd catch her watching me, lips pressed tight, like she was trying to figure out what to do with me. She once questioned why I still used my master credentials to access the internal systems, even though those were necessary for my role. "Isn't that a little outdated?" she said, laughing in a way that wasn't funny. It wasn't a question, it was a challenge. And yet I dismissed it. I told myself she was just finding her voice. But in truth, she wasn't finding her voice. She was sharpening her knife. And by the time I realized it, she had already decided I didn't fit into her vision of the company. Kelsey wielded her new power like a weapon, not a responsibility. She mistook control for competence, confusing the ability to make decisions with knowing how to make the right ones. It wasn't long before she started firing longtime staff, quietly at first. Old names began disappearing from internal memos. People like Sandra from finance and Victor from logistics, who'd been there nearly as long as I had. No farewell emails. No explanation. Just gone. She filled those roles with younger, cheaper hires, some barely out of business school, others clearly there because of family connections. Kelsey wasn't building a team. She was building a court. What made it worse was how easily the board let it happen. Most of them were absentee, rich, distracted, and happy to believe her reports so long as profits held steady. And at first, they did. Cost-cutting looked like efficiency on paper. Kelsey dressed it up with buzzwords like modernization and streamlining. But the truth was simple. She didn't know how to lead. She knew how to pose. She took credit for systems I had designed, for relationships I had nurtured. When things went wrong, she blamed old leadership, people like me. She wanted a legacy but didn't want to earn it. And I, the one person who could have helped her navigate it all, had become her biggest threat simply by existing. Everything changed when Kelsey decided to rewrite the rules, literally. She unveiled a brand new employee handbook without consulting a single department head. Overnight, the culture shifted. New dress codes, shorter deadlines, fewer sick days, mandatory innovation sessions that took up entire afternoons but produced nothing useful. It was control disguised as culture. She even went so far as to change our email signatures, forcing everyone to include her personal tagline. Progress starts here. It felt less like a company and more like a cult of personality. People were scared. Productivity dropped, but no one said anything aloud. Those who voiced concern were labeled resistant to change and pushed to the margins. I watched the soul of the company evaporate under fluorescent lights and hollow smiles. I tried once to speak up. I scheduled a meeting, laid out concerns backed with data, and offered solutions. She sat there silently, nodding, not writing a single note. When I finished, she smiled and said, "Thanks for the feedback." 2 weeks later, I was out. That's when I understood. Kelsey didn't want to fix the machine. She wanted to break it down and rebuild it in her own image, even if it meant burning everything that had made it work. To Kelsey, I was just another outdated cog in her shiny new engine. But in reality, I was the blueprint. I had access to everything: contracts, server logs, client histories, internal audits. I didn't flaunt it. I wasn't the type to throw around my importance. But it's one thing to hold keys, and another to know exactly which locks they open. My clearance level was above even hers, something I suspect she never realized. And if she did, she didn't understand what it meant. When you've built the foundation of a company, you know where the cracks are, what can collapse it, and what can hold it together. I never misused that access. Never once. Until the day she forced my hand. Because after that envelope landed on my desk, I started thinking differently. I didn't touch anything that could be traced. I didn't download files or send messages. I simply remembered. I remembered the private server backups I had set up during the expansion phase. I remembered the undocumented audit trail buried deep in the finance system, meant to protect the founder from exposure. I remembered the old contacts who still owed me favors. I wasn't just another employee. I was the institutional memory of Halden and Company, and no one fires the memory without consequences. Kelsey expected me to vanish quietly, head down, box of office items in hand. That's how she'd seen others go. She believed her position shielded her from consequence, that my silence would be part of the deal. After all, I was just old guard, someone who should be grateful to have lasted this long. But she didn't understand who she was dealing with. I didn't scream. I didn't plead. I simply packed up my things with care, leaving behind the framed photo of the original team, the one she had never bothered to look at. She watched me from her office window, arms crossed like she'd just swatted a fly. But I wasn't a fly. I was the architect, walking out of the building with the floor plans in his head. In her mind, the story was over. She'd cleaned house, gotten rid of the obstacle, and now could run things her way without interference. But power, real power, doesn't come from a title. It comes from what you know, and who you've helped. I had relationships she didn't even know existed, clients who called me first when something broke, vendors who gave me better rates off record, IT guys who trusted me more than their own department head. She thought I was gone. But in reality, I was just getting started. I kept quiet at first, not because I didn't want to act, but because the best revenge isn't loud, it's strategic. I spent the first few days gathering what I needed from memory. I knew the cloud server structure like the back of my hand. I knew which accounts had auto-renewing clauses and which had termination penalties. I knew which clients were underperforming but being inflated in reports. I didn't need to access a single file. I just needed to make a few well-placed calls, ask a few curious questions, and plant a few truths where the right people would find them. While she was busy updating her LinkedIn and posting corporate jargon about leading with boldness, I was stitching together a net. Quietly, cleanly. The board didn't suspect a thing. Neither did she. What I wanted wasn't noise, it was impact. And I wasn't going to just fight her. I was going to let her undo herself. All I had to do was put pressure on the right fault lines and wait. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's the sound of a storm gathering its strength. There were things about the company Kelsey had no clue about, because Charles Halden had made sure of it. I was his fixer. When we were still growing, mistakes were made, some big, some quiet, some best left buried. I helped cover them, reshape them, and sometimes erase them. I never broke the law, but I definitely bent the truth in ways that kept the company afloat. Like the time a senior VP funneled project funds into a shell firm, or the time we got sued for a failed system migration and paid the client in trade secrets to keep quiet. Every dark corner, I'd seen it. Kelsey, in her arrogance, had no understanding of this legacy. She thought running a business was about TikTok campaigns and minimalist office design. She didn't realize that the foundation beneath her was layered in compromise, loyalty, and secrets. And while I never weaponized that knowledge, her betrayal made me rethink everything. What had once been protected by my loyalty was now being threatened by her ignorance. I didn't need to invent anything to bring her down. I only had to let the truth breathe. And it was already gasping for air. Most people only knew how to use the system. I was the one who built it. Our back-end software, CRM database, finance tracking spreadsheets, even the automated compliance alerts. I had personally overseen or written the protocols for all of them. It had started years ago, when Charles asked me to modernize operations. I'd worked with a small team, trusted, discreet, efficient. We'd created redundancies for security and backups for disaster recovery. And buried within those systems were keys, passcodes, sequences, audit flags, that only a few of us knew. Kelsey wasn't one of them. When she took over, she'd insisted on changing our platforms, outsourcing to a flashy third-party vendor. But what she didn't realize was that her upgrades were built on top of our core framework. The skeleton was still mine. Every time she logged into her dashboard, she was seeing data that passed through filters I designed. And there were alerts, quiet ones, that notified me if someone tried to modify core permissions. She'd never even noticed them. Why would she? She assumed her access was absolute. But what I knew, and what she never even thought to question, was that real control doesn't live in the software. It lives in the architecture, and I was still holding the blueprints. Long before Kelsey ever walked through the front doors, I had put a contingency plan in place. Not because I anticipated betrayal, but because I knew business could turn on you without warning. Over the years, I had kept copies of key documents. Nothing sensitive or illegal, just the sort of information that proved who did what, when and why. Internal memos, contract changes, timeline approvals, budget authorizations, paper trails that told the real story of Halden and Company's growth. And I stored them off-site, encrypted, and safely backed up. Not out of paranoia, but out of habit. Because in every storm, it helps to know where the anchors are buried. When she fired me, I didn't panic. I reviewed my notes, organized the files, and made a few calls. Quiet, respectful inquiries to a handful of people still on the inside. People who trusted me more than they trusted her. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I just wanted the truth to be preserved. But I also knew that if the board ever asked me what happened, I could walk into that room with a clear conscience and a mountain of receipts. This wasn't revenge. This was preparation. And she'd handed me every reason I needed to use it. It started with a simple invitation, an off-calendar meeting with Jonathan Pierce, the head of the board. He asked me to lunch, casually, like old times. But I knew better. Nothing about Jonathan was ever casual. We met at a quiet restaurant, and after pleasantries, he leaned in and said, "There are concerns. About direction, about morale. Thought you might have some insight." I didn't jump at the opportunity. I let him talk. I let him ask. And then, carefully, I answered. I told him what I'd seen, what I'd heard, what I'd documented. I didn't slander her. I didn't need to. The facts were enough. I laid out how decisions were being made, how key personnel had been pushed out, how vital systems were being mismanaged. I showed him projections that Kelsey had altered to make short-term gains look like long-term success. His expression didn't change much, but I could see it in his eyes. Concern turning into something deeper. Doubt. He asked me to send over what I had. I agreed, with one condition. I wasn't coming back unless it was on my terms. I wasn't interested in reclaiming my old job. I was interested in saving the company from the very person who thought she could erase me. A week after that meeting, The shift was impossible to miss. Whispers moved like wildfire through the halls of Halden and Company. Board members were asking questions, real ones. They wanted performance metrics, vendor contracts, compliance logs. Kelsey, caught off guard, responded with panic charm and misdirection. But the numbers didn't lie, and neither did the files I'd sent to Jonathan. The more the board pulled on the thread, the more the seams began to show. Delayed projects, inflated expenses, critical vendor miscommunications she had glossed over. Her empire of perception was cracking, and fast. She tried to get ahead of it, scheduled an emergency all-staff meeting where she blamed legacy systems and outdated processes for recent setbacks. But it rang hollow. Her confidence was visibly slipping, and those in the room could feel it. She was no longer the poised, untouchable leader she had pretended to be. She was defensive, scrambling. And then came the board summons, one she couldn't dodge. No consultants, no assistants, just her, sitting across from people who were no longer nodding politely. That's when the real unraveling began. Inside that boardroom, where I had once fought to protect this company from collapse, Kelsey now faced a firing squad of her own making. I wasn't in the room, but I didn't need to be. The fallout spread fast. Her answers were vague, contradictory. She tried blaming turnover, then inflation, then compliance delays. But the data contradicted her every excuse. When they questioned a major vendor shift she had authorized, one that cost the company hundreds of thousands, she couldn't produce the documentation because it didn't exist. I knew that. I'd seen it coming when she bypassed our procurement process. She called me that night, for the first time since she fired me. Her voice was brittle, no trace of the arrogance she once wore like armor. "Ethan," she said, "I didn't know things were this bad. Can we talk?" I let the silence stretch for a moment before I answered. "There's nothing to talk about, Kelsey. You made your choices. Now you live with them." I didn't gloat. I didn't raise my voice. But she knew. She knew I had been the one to expose the cracks, and that I had done it without ever lifting a finger to sabotage. The truth had been her undoing, and I had simply stopped holding it back. When Charles Halden walked back into that building, the entire office went still. He had been out of the spotlight for over a year, recovering from a stroke and enjoying the illusion of retirement. But the board had called him, not as a formality, but as a last resort. The company was spiraling. Investors were getting nervous. And Charles, for all his flaws, still commanded respect. He called an executive meeting, and for the first time, Kelsey wasn't at the head of the table. She was seated along the side, just another employee under scrutiny. And beside Charles, to everyone's surprise, was me. I hadn't returned for a title. I wasn't there to take revenge. I was there to ensure the company didn't collapse under the weight of her ego. Charles didn't apologize outright, but the way he looked at me spoke volumes. After the meeting, he pulled me aside. "I trusted her too quickly," he admitted, "and I forgot who actually built this place." He offered me a consulting role, temporary, high-level, with full authority to clean up the mess. I accepted, not because I needed the job, but because I wanted to see it through. One last time. Kelsey's final mistake was believing that control meant holding the microphone. But real power, the kind that changes rooms, shifts decisions, and builds legacies, lives in trust. The morning I returned, the air was different. People greeted me with the kind of genuine respect that no amount of authority can buy. I didn't need to announce anything. I walked the halls, met with department heads, and quietly began untangling the damage she had done. I reset vendor relationships, reinstated key staff, brought back institutional memory that had been scattered like ashes. When the next board meeting came around, it was me at the head of the table. Kelsey sat silently, eyes fixed downward. She wasn't fired. Charles believed in letting people learn from their failures. But she was effectively sidelined, and she knew it. Her reign had ended, not with a scandal or a scream, but with the return of someone she never truly understood. I didn't need revenge. I had something better, restoration. And as I looked around that table, I realized something. This wasn't just about me. It was about legacy. And I had just reclaimed mine. Kelsey lost more in a single meeting than most people do in a lifetime. She didn't lose her job, at least not officially. But she lost her credibility, her authority, her illusion of control. The board stripped her of decision-making power, transferring all strategic responsibilities to me in my new capacity. Her title remained for optics, but everyone in the building knew where the real decisions were now being made. Departments that once feared her began reporting directly to me. Clients who had stopped responding came back to the table the moment they heard I was handling things again. But perhaps what stung her most wasn't the loss of power, it was the loss of image. Her whole identity had been built around being the bold, young visionary. And now, every person she had tried to intimidate looked at her with quiet pity. Her father, once her strongest advocate, no longer defended her in meetings. The staff stopped including her in critical discussions. She'd walk the halls and feel eyes on her, not with awe, but with doubt. And worst of all, she had no one to blame but herself. It didn't take months. It didn't take lawsuits. It happened in minutes, because when a leader loses trust, everything else follows. 3 months later, I walked out of Halden and Company for the last time. But this time, it was different. This time, I wasn't forced out or blindsided. I handed in my final report, shook the hands of people who mattered, and walked out with my head high. I had righted the ship. The company was stable, the board satisfied, the team stronger than before. And Kelsey? She remained, technically, but she was no longer in the way. She now reported to someone else entirely, and the leash was tight. She avoided my gaze that last day, and I didn't force it. Some lessons don't need words. As I stepped outside, a breeze hit me, and for the first time in years, I felt light. I had given this company everything I had. I'd protected it, bled for it, and when it tried to cast me aside, I reminded it who had really built the foundation, not through sabotage, not through revenge, but through quiet, deliberate power. I didn't just leave on my terms, I left with the legacy intact. And the keys? I never needed to return them, because by the time I walked out, everyone knew I had already used them to lock in the truth. If you were in my shoes, would you have stayed quiet, or done what I did? What would you have done with the keys she didn't know I still had? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed this story, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next twist.